Good morning, folks. Welcome to another Chit Chats with Kit Kats. Got my morning coffee, and I am very excited to have with me Ding Dong, who's at my front door. It is none other than Michael Ibrahim. How are you, Michael?
Good, Rick. How are you, buddy?
I'm doing very well, mate. Very well.
It's to virtually catch up with you.
Yeah, it's actually nice to finally meet you, mate. I've spoken to you on the phone before, and very well aware of your amplifiers and effects, all Australian-based here.
Yep.
Mate, what I don't know is much about the Michael Ibrahim story and how you got into the whole electronic side of things. Do you care to enlighten me?
Yeah. I come from a family of electrical engineers. My father is an electrical engineer, and he actually met my mother at university back in Egypt. She was also an electrical engineer. My sister is the dark horse of the family. She's a doctor, but we forgive her for that nonetheless. So we emigrated to Australia in 1982. So I was 8 years old at the time. And very very quickly I got into music, but music for me was actually something that preceded all of that. Back in Egypt, actually, my dad worked. So he was a lecturer at Cairo University. He was a senior lecturer.
Oh, cool!
And electrical engineering. And the income back then wasn't very good, so he used to moonlight doing a whole bunch of other things as well. So one of the things that he did actually was he worked as an engineer in a recording studio.
Cool.
Back when engineers actually did engineering.
Yep.
So he used to have to build equipment for them, and things would bust, and he'd have to design stuff from scratch for them and do all that sort of stuff. So so I used to come home with music all the time because one of the things that they did in this particular studio in Cairo was pirate a whole bunch of Western music.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So he used to come home with a whole bunch of. I remember things like rather embarrassingly ABBA, Bonnie M. Santana. I think was my first real intro to guitar through
Nice.
Dad's collection. But yeah. So when we came to Australia, going into teenagehood, I discovered rock music, and that was really what set me on the path. And then as I kind of approached university age, I said, "Oh, look, Mum and Dad, I don't want to go to uni. I want to join a band and tour." And my father, knowing A, that I'm not particularly talented on the guitar, and B, how difficult it is to actually do that successfully, was very, very smart. He said, "Look, I tell you, why don't you consider doing something with engineering? That way you can build your own equipment when you get super famous and tour the world, and that way you can say, look, I can use my own stuff." So I have very naively said, "Oh, yeah, okay, all right, fair enough." So I enrolled in Eng, and that was kind of when my dreams of rock and roll stardom started to evaporate as I realised the limitations of my talent.
Aha.
But yeah.
It seems like a pretty common story of people wanting to get into it and having a talent at something behind the scenes, because it is a very, you've got to be very lucky to make it as an artist, if there is such a thing as luck. But it seems like a very common story. Now, you said that your dad was working in recording studios and you hung out. Do you think that helped to tune your ear to what a good sound is?
I think it helped to tune my understanding of the way the equipment worked.
Okay.
But not necessarily the sound. I mean, it's interesting because when I started to do MI audio, and my father is still somebody that I very much look up to and to take his advice seriously. So when I first started MI Audio, I said, I want to start, maybe I might do some stuff with vacuum tubes. He was like, vacuum tubes? Why would you do that? They're horrible. They're unreliable. We've got transistors now. You don't need vacuum tubes. So it's kind of a generational ideological divide there.
Absolutely, because there is just something golden about the randomness of using tubes, isn't there, as opposed to solid state designs.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, every amplifier that goes out, it really does sound different, and often it's the vacuum tubes, particularly the preamp tubes that are responsible for that, much more so than the power tubes. But I mean, look, there's a real, and the other thing as well is trying to explain to him that I wanted to distort the signal.
Yep.
And he was like, why the hell do you want to do that?
Sure. Yeah. It doesn't make sense, does it?
Yeah. We spend all of our time as engineers, training to get the distortion out.
Yeah. There's a word for that, something that's technically incorrect but sounds pleasing, isn't there? Is that euphonic?
Yeah, absolutely.
Euphonic. Yeah. So what came first for you, building pedals or designing amps?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, actually, the very first project I ever worked on was an amplifier. So when I was 14 and my parents bought me my first electric guitar, which was a bloody horrible Epiphone Ibanez knockoff.
Oh, right, yeah.
It was really bad. Everything above the 14th fret didn't work, but that's a different story. So when they first got that guitar for me, I kind of went, oh, awesome, fantastic. Where do I plug it in? And they went, well, just plug it into the stereo. So I did that for a little while, and then eventually I went, oh, no, I need an amplifier, Mum and Dad. And Dad said, well, if you want an amplifier, you're going to have to build one. So he did a... So it was really interesting, actually. So he designed an amplifier, and he showed me how to etch the PCB, and gave me the component list and said, okay, load it here. And so I built it must have been like a little 15-watt solid-state amplifier. And then after that, I said, oh, look, it's not loud enough. I need something with a bit more grunt. So then I went out and got here in Australia, we've got a electronics chain called J-Car. It's kind of like the equivalent of, I don't know, what are the big electronics chains in the US?
I don't know, mate. Radio Shack? Yeah.
They're kind of the equivalent of our Radio Shack here. And so I pieced together a guitar amplifier from a couple of kits there. So that was really the first thing. But commercially, in terms of actually having a crack, it would have been pedals. Yep. So that goes back to about 95 when I started to muck around with pedals.
Cool. And were you inspired by any particular type of pedal? I know, talking to some guys, they start off modifying current designs and coming up with their own. Was that something that you did, or did you just completely build one from scratch? And are you willing to share where you started, where you got the inspiration from?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So the thing for me, back in 95, I had a Roland JC 120, which I still have, a beautiful amplifier, but obviously not a warm amplifier. So I wanted to sound like Alan Holsworth.
Cool.
So I said, okay, well, my rat distortion pedal's not cutting it. It just sounds really harsh through that amplifier. How do I produce that sort of sound with my budget? And so it was at the time Holsworth was using interestingly using a Mesa Boogie dual rectifiers.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and so I kind of looked at a rectifier and said, okay, well, there's the cathode follower in the preamp, and then there's 4 valve stages before it. So maybe as opposed to trying to get the distortion out of one stage, maybe if I actually kind of clip the signal multiple times so that the distortion happens gradually as opposed to all of a sudden, then that'll produce a more pleasing tone. So that was the experiment that I did, and that was actually what gave birth to the Tube Zone. So that was... back in 95 when I started mucking around with that particular design. Yeah, but, right. I mean, look, as with all people, there is a marketing narrative that we like to spin, which is that, I wasn't happy with anything out there, and so I wanted to design my own thing. The reality is that you put it together, if you don't electrocute yourself and it works, you're bloody over the moon. So that's the reality, I think, for a lot of people,
Yeah. Speaking of that, have you had any close calls?
Oh, hell yeah. Just the other week, I zapped myself. Yeah. Look, I've actually been fairly lucky with that. I've only done it a handful of times. I know, speaking to a lot of other amp techs, they say it's something that happens on almost on a weekly basis. But
Yeah.
um,
I guess you learn the
yeah,
tricks though of touching with the back of your hand so you don't clench or anything.
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And when when I'm poking around inside an amplifier, I like to have not that this is necessarily advice for anybody. This isn't legal advice,
Yep. Yep.
legal safety advice, but just to work with one hand behind your back so that if you do short somewhere, it doesn't go through your heart. And
Okay, I didn't know that.
yeah, yep. So if you've got if you're working with two hands on the amplifier and you touch something, then the current path is kind of that way. So
Okay.
but yeah, once again, not legal safety advice.
Sure.
So.
So you said you started back in '95 with the Tube Zone pedal. You called it, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I started mucking around with that design and using it, and I ended up just building a small number and just selling them. I think maybe I spent maybe about 4 years selling about 20 of them or so.
Okay.
And it wasn't until kind of 2002 that I went, maybe I'll have a crack at actually doing this commercially. So so that was the path that I took.
Great.
To start my audio. Yeah.
And were you just working out at home to start off with, and then built it up to working in a factory, or?
Yeah, so I started off working from home. In fact, it was kind of my nighttime job. I had a regular daytime job working at that stage. I was working at a software startup company called Dilithium Networks, doing software development for mobile phone transcoding.
Okay.
That's something technical and boring. I won't bore you with that, but So I used to come home and assemble these pedals, and my wife would help me. I'd drill out the cases, and the very earliest ones actually I etched the PCBs myself, and but we just build those and sell them. And look back then, I think it was a lot easier. So literally all I did was I just put up a single page website. Put up a little news item on Harmony Central, back when that was really big, and people started buying, and I was like, that's kind of weird.
Yeah, right. Okay.
I wasn't expecting people to really buy, but I think I bought parts for 50 pedals, and they sold out in a couple of months, and then Teddy over at Music Toys. He back then with the largest online retailer contacted me and said, well, I want to buy some. And I was like, I hadn't actually thought of that. I don't have a dealer margin or anything. So then I had to work very quickly to work out how I was going to do manufacture and pricing. And so I did that probably for about a year or maybe 2 years until I went, you know what, I'm quitting my day job, and I'm going to have a crack at doing this full time. So
Cool. And was there a point where like a name player or anything like that came along and started using your pedals to give you a bit of a kickstart? Because
look, that side of the business, I must admit, I'm really terrible at. My thinking has always been to just try to make the stuff as reasonably priced for the average punter as possible.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, look, I've had heaps of players use my stuff. Here in Australia, Brett Garsed, I think, was one of the first big name Australian players to use my stuff.
I have Brett coming on the show on Monday, actually.
Oh, awesome. Fantastic. So I've had a long relationship with Brett. So he would have been really the first big name player that I had. But my pedals have ended up all over the place.
I know Dave Leslie was using your amps for a bit there.
Yep,
Bob Spencer gave you a great shout out a couple of weeks ago as well.
Yep. Bob Satriani's got some of my pedals.
Cool.
I think Vi has them as well. I think I sent some to Steve Vi as well. But just all over the place. I know that the Edge actually has a Blues Pro.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. But, that was not our doing. That happened independently of us.
Yeah.
But yeah, so yeah, pretty exciting for a fairly small operation. But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think that the marketing and endorsement side of things is an interesting business conundrum that I personally haven't really worked out yet. But that'll be something interesting to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So is there any wish list players that you'd love to see using your gear?
Oh, look, for me, I think that sadly no longer possible. Alan Holsworth. I actually even got his home phone number from somebody in the industry, and they said, "Look, just phone him up and send him something." And I was just too scared. I thought, no, I'm not going to. And you know, sadly, obviously, he passed away. Was it 2 years ago now? Yeah, maybe 3 years ago. 3 years ago, yeah.
Yeah.
So that would have been my absolute number one.
Yeah.
On the wish list, but
yeah. So, in terms of your own guitar playing, because you did say you started out playing yourself and needing some tools, so you built them yourself. Is that the style of playing that you go for yourself, the Holdsworth legato kind of thing, or are you?
That's what I would like to go for.
Yeah.
But look, at the end of the day, I'm just a rock hack who tries to pretend he's intelligent. it kind of to justify my wrong notes.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that might have a lot to do with your amplifier design and sort of, okay, how do I make this a bit more suited to my playing? Before I get to the amplifiers, you said you started in '95 with the Tube Zone. How many pedals have you got now that you make?
At the moment, I've got 7 that are in production. So predominantly Overdrive. I've got one delay pedal, a boost pedal. But as with all these things, I've got so many plans. But now that my production has gone full circle, so I'm
I just did a quick little flick to a screen of your website there of just some of the effects. So when you say you've only got a few there, I can see them. They're actually covered up by a whole bunch of other little windows I've got going there, so I can't see it too well, but hopefully people got a quick little glimpse of that. Amplifier design.
Yes.
You went from doing the pedals, and amps, I'm assuming, would be a lot more complicated to be building.
Yeah. I mean, look, I must admit, I do find the amps a lot more satisfying, just from a technical perspective. The pedals are a much more straightforward affair. So, I mean, amps I have been mucking around with on and off for, all the way back to my teenage years. But my first crack at a commercial amp design was, in fact, I designed 2 amplifiers. A big amplifier which never made it into production, which was actually an 8-channel amplifier.
Whoa!
Yes. Now there are rumors about the correlation between the number of channels and genitalia, and I'd like to confirm that those rumors are in fact true. I'm trying to compensate for something. No. This conversation is going in a very strange direction.
That's okay, mate. That's okay. I like that. I'm just going to say, when I said I went to the screenshot, and I had this happen before, and I know why. It's because I'm using the Bluetooth, but I actually lost your audio for a second then as I went to your webpage. So I do apologize, folks. Thank you for letting me know in the chat. Note to self, get on top of that. Every time I go to a screenshot, it does lose the guest for a second. And I think I know why, but yeah, my apologies, folks. I know about that, so I won't let that happen. So you said you had the 8 channels built into the one amp. Was that something that actually went into production, or was that
no, it didn't. Yeah. So what I thought I'd do is I thought, okay, that's a little bit ridiculous.
Yeah.
So what I did was I released my small baby amp, which was the Revelation, which is a 4-channel, 12-mode MIDI switching 4FX loop deal. So that was that was at a time, I think, where obviously modeling amps were really starting to take off.
Yep.
And I had to look at a lot of other big amplifiers. And one of the things that I saw that was missing from the market was, all of the big amps kind of had a signature sound to them. Mm-hmm. So just before I released the Revelation, I think Marshall came out with the JVM. And I was very excited about it. Went down to the guitar store and tried it out. But for me, just to my ears at least, it kind of sounded like 12 modes of Marshall. They all had kind of a Marshall sound to them.
Sure. And
I also owned a Mesa Boogie Road King. I mean, for me, I was very excited when I saw the specs of the Road King, all the tube switching and all the, once again, 12 different channel voicings. But it all kind of sounded like Mesa. Mm. And so I thought to myself, there's an opportunity here to do an amplifier which kind of does what the digital modeling stuff does. Which is really to provide you with 12 fairly distinct sounds. So that was the genesis of the idea for the Revelation. So I then went to NAMM in 2008 and took that over with me. So that was my first foray into amps, which then kind of spurred a whole bunch of other amps that went into production after that.
Okay. So with the Revelation, that's the one that's got all the effects loops and everything built into it as well.
Right. Yeah.
So essentially a whole rack switching system, which
exactly. Yeah.
How did you find that for maintenance? If something was to go wrong in there, that's a hell of a lot of stuff to pack into an amp.
Well, actually, what ended up happening was it wasn't so much a maintenance issue. It was really just an assembly issue. So the very first amp I made as compact as possible, but it meant that if I did need to assemble it, I had to assemble it in a very particular order. And once one component went in, if I needed to remove that, I had to remove a whole bunch of other ones, and it was just a nightmare to build. And then I thought, oh man, it's going to be a nightmare for maintenance as well.
Yeah.
So then I ended up moving to a version 2 where I kept a very similar design, but increased the size of the chassis just to make it a little bit easier for me to assemble. But I still sell a couple of those amps not very many. They are a bit of a pain to build, obviously, given the fact how complex they are. But the other thing I think that was really interesting, and I think this also came out of my own experience with digital modeling stuff. So I had kind of an all-tube version of digital modeling. What I found with a lot of customers, I go, how are you finding the amp? They go, oh, fantastic. Channel 2, mode 3 is awesome, and channel 4, mode 1 is awesome. I go, okay, what about the other 10 modes? And they go, oh, no, I don't use those. So then I kind of went, maybe this amp does a little bit too much.
Sure.
And maybe what I need to be doing is kind of focusing on a particular genre or a particular style of amp, and then producing simpler amplifiers that then really nail that particular sound. And so that they're the amps actually for me that sell a lot better.
Okay. Well, I guess with the simpler ones, people could use overdrives and other virtual preamps, I guess, to shape the tone if there's a particular flavor they want, right?
Yeah. And look, I think for me as well, given the fact that my primary bread and butter is in fact the pedals, I do have a particular sensitivity to the applicability of pedals to amplifiers, in the sense that I want to make sure that all the amps that I build actually play really well with pedals, because that's where I came from. Yep. I think for me as well, the variety of particularly amplifier clean channels really shaped the way I did pedal design. So with pedal design, one of the things that I always like to do is not assume a particular amplifier that the pedal's being plugged into. So people often complain that my stuff has got a lot of knobs and switches, but that's really grew out of the engineering problem, of not knowing how much top end there was going to be on an amplifier. Do they have a bright cap across the gain control? Is the mid range really scooped or is it really prominent? So just having enough controls in there for people to be able to then shape the sound of the pedal to suit the platform.
Okay, so in terms of inspiration for these channels that you've got in the amps, what are the benchmarks for you? Like, because I asked that knowing that people tell me, I'm no engineer, but people tell me there's three main basic circuits that everything's based on: the Fender, Marshall, and Vox, and that overdrive pedals all react differently to those circuits. What are the benchmark amps for you that when you're building multiple channel amps? What's the inspiration?
Yeah, well, I guess it's interesting because it's changed. So back when I started the business, I thought, okay, so what happens in a regular touring scenario? In a regular touring scenario, you're going to end up with some kind of big Fender that you hire, or a JCM 800 or something along those lines. And so they were the ones that I had in the back of my mind as pedals. Now it's different. I mean, I think very sadly with the slow demise of live music and kind of a generation of guitarists that are now becoming whose experience is predominantly a recording experience. I think it really changes the way that pedal design is approached. So now I'm actually thinking more along the lines of, okay, so this person might take my pedal and plug it into an Axe FX, or
Do you find that pedals react differently to an Axe FX versus a tube amp? Like I know personally, if I'm watching guitar demos, product demos online, and they're doing everything through an Axe FX, that to me, I'm thinking I don't play through a modeler. Oh, sometimes I do, and if I do, it's all built in there. I want to be using an analog front end, and there's a lot of modular preamps these days which you can run through speaker IRs and get a monster tone. How do you feel about that? About running your pedal into a modeler versus a real tube amp?
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously with the real tube amp, there's a lot of magic there. And look, the modeler is getting better and better, and there's plenty of scenarios, I think, where the use of a modeler is really justified. And the reality of touring these days, I completely get it, and I actually find that kind of technology actually quite exciting. I'm not opposed to that technology at all, but look, there's something about a tube amp which there's just an immediacy there that you just cannot get from a modeler. From a purely technical perspective, I mean, there's all sorts of complexities that happen with the input impedance and the millicapacitance and the way that the power supply reacts. But even beyond that, I mean, I think one of the reasons that if you listen to an AC/DC album that it's just magic is because that we're getting not squealing feedback, but there's a feedback that happens when your amplifier speaker is actually creating sound pressure. It changes the way that the strings themselves vibrate, and I think that we've lost that connection with modern recording techniques. It sounds fine. It sounds very controlled and for the average punter, I completely get that they don't, that it doesn't really make that much difference. It doesn't really even make that much difference to me. But I just think that real controlled environment, we are losing some of that magic of real amps, real bands. It's all the in-between stuff that's the magic,
Yeah.
It's not, it's for example, for modelers versus tube amps, it's not so much the chords or the notes that sound wrong, but it's the pick attack, and it's the sound of that your fingers make when you slide on the strings. It's that ability to be able to immediately locate your sound source to go, right, my sound is coming from right there, as opposed to somewhere in the distance, and it's being then projected to me.
Yeah. I often bring up when people ask me my opinion on the modelers that a lot of the time they sound great if you just want to practice at home and not play with a band. But for me, you really notice it when you're playing in a band situation with another guitar player who's using a real tube amp, and even recording wise. So I've had the Kempers and the Axe-FXs and the Helixes. And the most notable thing for me has been the way they sit in a mix. I had an Axe-FX 2, perhaps, going back a few years ago now, and I was trying to record some guitar parts for an artist that I was producing a record for. I struggled for weeks trying to get a sound that would sit in the mix, that if it sat where it should, you could actually hear the notes that were being played.
Yeah.
If I turned it up to a point where you could hear the notes, it drowned out everything else. And I know about pulling out the frequencies that shouldn't be there. It's just the edges of the sound. It doesn't have its own little place.
Yeah.
I actually bought an Egnator tweaker amp online and got it sent over from America. So it was the first one in Australia. And within 5 minutes of turning that thing on, I'd recorded this track that I'd laboured on for weeks. So that's, for me, where it comes in. And I'm not sure if that's actually miking the speaker or not. I don't think it is, because I've been going down the road of using speaker IRs a lot lately. Yeah. And just talking to Steve Stevens last week, and he said that once he tried speaker IRs, that's what they're doing live now, and his sound guy just can't believe the difference that made. Is that something you've ever considered putting into your amps as an option of having a speaker IR out?
Yeah,
a loader?
Look, definitely. I'm actually working on a couple of designs at the moment. But yeah, because there is that shift, I think, to indoor, bedroom playing.
Yep.
Even amongst the guitarists who are quite proficient and really professional. Then there's definitely a shift towards that. And I've mucked around with. I've got a pretty good analog design for a speaker simulator that I've put on a couple of custom amp builds that I've done for people.
Nice.
Some of these designs that I'm working on, some smaller, physically smaller and lower power amplifiers, are going to have built-in analog speaker simulation. I would actually like to go down the road of some digital stuff with my background in software engineering as well. Hopefully it shouldn't be too difficult, but it's been a while since I've done that for a living. But IR technology itself is quite simple.
Okay.
It should be. Yeah, it's something I'd definitely like to explore. Yeah.
Sure. Now, you said earlier about the tubes not being correct, and we're actually looking at distorting them a lot. You've got some lower wattage amps, which you're going to get a lot more drive out of, well, not drive, but just that sponginess out of the tube section. But you've also got some incredibly powerful amps as well, haven't you? Like, is it 160 watts or something I saw on your website?
Yeah, that's actually a little bit conservative. Most of them actually put out closer to 190. But it's better to undersell than oversell.
Yeah, and are you doing that so that you have that extra headroom, so that you're not coloring the sound with the power amp section?
Yeah, that comes from a particular stylistic need. So that the amplifier that you're referring to is the Megalith, which is an amplifier that I designed specifically for high gain playing. And so with high gain playing, the direction it's still going now is really percussiveness, very quick response, to be able to use the analogy of kind of driving a car. It corners beautifully.
Yeah.
So because of that, it's the kind of design where you don't want the power amplifier to have too much momentum, where you can't follow the nuances as quickly as possible. So because of that, headroom really is key. The other thing as well is, with a lot of heavier music that requires more bass, what happens is your ear naturally reacts more to the mids and to the high frequencies. So you feel the bass, but you hear the mids and the highs. So if you want to have the mids and the highs at a particular level, and your bass is in fact much higher than that, then you need that headroom in the power amplifier so that you don't run out of headroom and dynamics. So what happens is basically if your bass is going up and you turn up the volume, if your amplifier isn't powerful enough, then you kind of hit the rails very quickly. And then as you turn up, then the bass doesn't go anywhere. It just starts to distort and mush up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the technical reason for why I decided to go down that particular road. But it's interesting because I think as well what's happened is that there's a lot of kind of internet folklore associated with power amps, and so often I'll be contacted by people who say, even the small version of that amplifier is an 80 watt, puts out more like 90 watts, and people contact me and say, oh no, that's way too much, I only need 15 watts, but I really want a big bassy, brutal amp sound of it. And I try to explain to them, well, trust me, that 90 watts is going to deliver that for you, because you're not going to you're not going to hit the rails. Mm-hmm. But because they're online and they're hearing people talk about, no, it's better to have a low wattage amp and you drive the power amp. Well, that doesn't work for metal, for kind of modern metal.
Yeah.
So they're kind of mixing up genres a little bit there.
Yep. Yep. I know when what I'm looking for in a good hard rock metal amp is the ability to palm mute and have that low end pop forward in the speaker, not compress back into itself. Yep. Is that that's to do with the headroom of the wattage, or would that come down to things like power supply and sag and all that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's so much. There are so many variables in that. I mean, it's the how much sag does your power transformer have? Some power transformers are designed for up to 20% sag, so they're operating at a voltage, and then as soon as you ask for a lot of current, the voltage drops by about 20%.
Sure.
There's also then those transformers and then charging capacitors. How big are those capacitors? So even if the transformer can deliver the current, if you ask for too much current from the capacitors, then the voltage on the capacitors drops as well as getting AC ripple on those capacitors as well. How much your negative feedback is also a very important aspect of delivering that kind of punch as well. So your standard amplifier negative feedback configuration works, and the more headroom you have, the better it works. But there are other ways of getting punch out of a power amplifier that involve very careful use of negative feedback in the power amp section to deliver that. And then there's also your output transformer. What kind of frequency response does the output transformer have? There's a whole bunch of the more the power goes up on a typical transformer, then the higher the cutoff frequency becomes for the transformer as a result of core saturation. So there's also those things to keep in mind as well. So if you're using, for example, a typical Fender sort of design, so this is a sweeping generalization, but if you grab a 100 watt Fender transformer, then they're designed to just be able to give you 100 watts at about 100 hertz. So if you push them a little bit more than that, then that frequency goes up, and you can't really get the full power at lower frequencies.
Okay.
If you're detuning your guitar, it's not really going to work. So there's just so many considerations.
It sounds like there's a whole bunch of stuff that comes into play. You might gain 10% from this, 10% from that, but collectively, if you had 5 of those things, you're going to be 50% better, I guess, huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And then there's all sorts of interesting kind of more artistic things as well to do with component choice and component layout and the way that you do the PCB design, and there's so much stuff. It's really the way I describe it to people, and I'm sure a lot of the amp designers that you'll speak to will say this, a lot of it is more like art than it is engineering, and I often describe, when I design something and I stick up a photo on Facebook, I'll say, "This is my art."
Yep.
I'm not saying it to be dramatic. It really feels like an artistic. I feel like I'm painting. I feel like I've got a canvas there in front of me, and I'm throwing colours down. And sometimes I don't exactly know. I'll start a design because I'm feeling really inspired, but I'm not entirely sure where it's going to go. And it's as I'm doing it, it evolves, and I'm very free with the way that I do it. Yeah,
Cool.
So
cool.
Yeah.
And have you come up with some great happy accidents doing it that way?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Certainly in terms of feature sets or even down to track placement, has had an impact on tone, and it's done something that I didn't quite expect. Maybe a little bit of a small bit of positive feedback somewhere has produced a little notch in the frequency response that gives a pleasing effect. But it's really interesting because as those happy accidents happen and you learn, you go, why the hell did that happen? And then you kind of figure out, I'll put that track next to that one. And so there's a little bit of positive feedback, and that becomes then something that you then put in your back pocket, a little bit of, something to add to your arsenal.
Absolutely. Yeah. Cool. Now, have you experimented much with designing rack gear, or would you much prefer having everything in the one head off the one power supply?
Oh, look, I'm a child of the 80s, so
Same.
I've got a soft spot in my heart for rack gear, buying the guitar mags and seeing, Kirk Hammett with a giant fridge.
88,
there you go,
I got an 88 right behind me there. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and look, I think with that shift that we're seeing towards, for want of a better term, kind of home recording, there is going to be more and more demand, I think, for racks. I'm hoping rack will come back. I'm doing a couple of rack designs at the moment for some valve preamps and maybe some programmable stuff as well.
Cool.
But yeah, for me, it's just an issue of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think part of the problem as well, I've got a real short attention span. So I get really excited about a design, and I'll sit there and work on it for a week non-stop, and I don't get any sleep, and my wife and kids complain that they don't see me, and then I go, oh no, I better go back to, I've got pedal orders to do, I better go back and do pedals, and then I'll go back and do that, and then I'll go back to the design and go, forget it. Yeah.
Sounds like you might have ADD like me. I only just discovered a couple of years ago that I have ADD, which everything made sense when they went through all the symptoms.
Well, actually, I have had a psychologist say that to me. I do have some ADD type. I display some ADD type.
Just the symptoms, and So it's not such a bad thing. And I think most people who are creative and can focus, when I was told as well that I was like, oh, what, really? No, that doesn't sound right. And they went through all the symptoms, and they said it's actually desirable trait to have, because you can be extremely focused on something. If you're really into something, and it sounded like it when you said it, you're just obsessed with it. But for me, one of the classic symptoms is if I don't give a fuck about something, I really don't give a fuck about something. And they say that's one of the things. Like you asked me about my intro and everything at the start of the show, and you seemed surprised when I said, no, I do it all myself.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I did really well at film and television in high school.
Yeah. And
I can remember my teacher pulling me aside and saying, man, you are so far ahead of everybody else, but I have to fail you, because the assignments, where you've got to do a review on, the movie Of Mice and Men and stuff, you just don't do it. I'm like, that doesn't interest me, man. So it could be a good thing that that focus. Michael, I wanted to ask you, I haven't had a look inside any of your amps. Are you a PCB kind of guy, or is it point to point?
PCB.
Yep.
So where that started for me really was dreams of having a huge amplifier empire.
Yep.
And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to need to make sure that I do it PCB in order to make it producible.
Yep.
So I've always got an eye to production. The reality is at the moment, I'm building all my amps by hand. So ironically, doing them point to point might actually be a little bit quicker and a little bit cheaper
Oh, wow. Okay.
than a PCB. But
Yeah.
look, there's definitely a reproducibility that you get with PCB, and there's also higher component density. So there are some things, for example, where I might use a microcontroller and a whole bunch of switching logic, and doing that on PCB is a lot more convenient than doing that point to point. But look, I've got absolutely nothing. I'm not interested in PCB versus point to point wars. I think that point to point amps do have a particular sound, and over the years I've kind of learnt how to coax some of that out of my PCB design.
Okay.
So the stuff I'm doing at the moment has more of a point-to-pointy sound to it, and really it's about managing your ground planes, making sure that you're not that you do the track layout in a way where the capacitive coupling doesn't rob any of your top end. And like you said, with that 10% thing adding up, if you're not careful with your track layout, and you rob half a dB from the top end at one valve stage, and then half a dB at the next, and half a dB at the next, and then let's say you do a PCB layout of a blackface deluxe reverb, all that little bit of robbing of say your top end, because that's often where it happens, does add up, and then you plug into it and go, oh, that sounds fine, and then you plug into a real deluxe reverb and go, oh, there's so much chime, and but I've got exactly the same circuit. What's going on?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, so just on a personal note, I'm very intrigued as to how the new Soldano venture is going to go, because the photos I've seen of the PCB is, the PCB doesn't appear to have been designed by Mike Soldano, so it's probably part of the boutique amp distribution. Someone from the design team did it, and they did it very efficiently, but it's very different. And there's a part of me that goes, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to scope up the two of them, an original slow and see what difference the PCB has made to the tone.
Interesting you should say that, because actually if you Google SLO 100, the first thing that comes up is me, a video that I did a couple of years ago. I borrowed one off a local friend. Thanks, Ruwan. And I do know the guys at Boutique Amps Distribution, and I would really like to do a comparison of the new one, say the 30-watt version, to the original SLO 100, just to see if there is much of a difference.
It'd be interesting. Yeah, it'd be interesting to compare the 100 against the 100.
Even better still. Getting one out to me, being in Australia, might be a bit hard though, just with freight and everything. But
and the thing that'll be interesting won't be the what sound you have when you have got a sustained power chord. That should be the same, but like I said, it's going to be in the sliding your fingers on the strings. It's going to be in the pick attack. It's all those little things where that a couple of percent here and there will actually have an impact on the sound. But obviously, I wish nothing but the best for Mike Soldano and his new venture and all that sort of stuff. So it's not at all an attempt at a criticism, but it's just a kind of a technical observation of the changes that happen as a result of PCB layout.
Well, Mike did have plans on completely retiring the brand, because he's been a one-man show this whole time, and I do believe it was when he was on the show Tone Talk with my friends Dave Friedman and Mark Ozansky that he was talking about retiring, hang up the boots, and Dave had a word to him afterwards and said, man, you should talk to these guys and license your design. And that's kept it around. So very interested to see how that goes.
And look, I'm really glad that they've done that. I mean, the SLO is such a significant part of guitar history. It'd be a pity to see that consigned to the history books of guitar tone. It's great to see that still going. And I do feel very sorry for Mike Soldano. Obviously, he's been quite ripped off by quite a few other designers.
Dual rectifier, straight out with it. Dual rectifier, wire for wire copy with a different power amp section.
Yeah, with a very weak power section. Different gain control. So if you take a rectifier and you change the gain pot from the 250k to a 500k, then it becomes almost identical to the and obviously that they've changed the EQ a little bit to add a little bit high end cut in the rectifier.
Yeah.
High and mid cut. Yeah. So that's what gives it that extra bassiness. But I do feel very sorry for him. Having said that, I am very tempted to go, if I was to do a slow, what would it look like? And so I'm building one for myself as a as a personal project.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a different sound to some of the other hot-rodded Marshall designs out there. And but when you're listening critically to things, does it all come through visually for you? I know when I'm mixing or listening to amplifiers and trying to critique, there's different visualizations that come to mind for me. And just talking about the Soldano, for me, I have this sound that pops into my mind when I hear that distortion. And it's going to sound really funny, but what's the cartoon done by the Simpsons guy, Futurama?
Futurama, yep.
Bender's mouth, just that grid.
Yeah.
That's what the breakup on a Soldano SL1 sounds to me.
Right.
To me like. Whereas when I listen to Dave Friedman's designs, and I've said this to him, and he's like, very interesting. I see in my mind when I'm looking at a speaker, it's like someone has their mouth open and there's that little bit that hangs down in the back of your throat and it's vibrating. That's his breakup to me, and it just sits just in front. And it's the weirdest thing. I also, smells, I relate to frequencies. Yeah, like if somebody drops a fart or something, and it could be like, oh, that's really cutting 1 to 2K, or it could be oh man, that was a 200 or a 150, that one. Yeah. Do you experience the same thing? Visualizations?
Look, definitely. There is a synesthetic dimension to tone, but it is actually quite interesting in the sense that there's an evolutionary argument that really that synesthetic trait is a very important evolutionary tool for us. But no, definitely for me, I think that there's a real crossover across the senses.
Yeah.
But I mean, for me, it's really predominantly a feel issue. So, that feel you get from an amplifier, and the way that it makes the air around you vibrate. They all have their own signature, and that's a dare I say, it's a beautiful thing. I love the fact that a slow is not a Friedman, is not a MI, is not a Bogner, it's not not a Fender. Each of them has their own signature, and I really love tracing through the signature of the designer as well. I mean, for me, as somebody who looks at the guts of amps a lot, there are certain tonal as well as physical signatures that you can see that come from a particular designer. And so I really appreciate those kind of fingerprints that you get with sounds. Dave Friedman's a great example. He's got a particular signature that carries across all of his designs, which is really quite unique. And obviously Mike Soldano, and I'm a really big fan of Bogner amps. I think that they do a great. They're wonderful both tonally as well from a design perspective.
Okay.
Looking inside a Bogner amplifier is a beautiful experience.
Yeah.
So
now you mentioned just the feel of amps, and that's one thing I think tube amps have over the modelers is just how it feels to play them. When you're tweaking, do you sit there with guitar in hand as you're making
absolutely.
adjustments? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and I think part of the problem for me is that process never actually stops. So even an old design like the Revelation, which I've been building now for 13 years, I still tweak it. I still sit there and go, oh look, I don't know, I'm not quite happy with that, or you know, I might, you know, as somebody, as everybody matures, you kind of acquire a bank of experience. And so when I look back at the Revelation design, I think, you know, I was too focused on this particular aspect of design, where really I should have considered A, B, and C as well, not just D.
Yep.
Yeah. So because of that, I'm constantly tweaking. Every time I come across that happy accident and I put it in my back pocket, and I know that it's there, it makes me then question everything that I've done before.
Mm-hmm.
And I go, oh, if only I'd, you know, done this particular thing with the track layout on the Revelation.
Yeah.
Oh, if only I'd used high capacitance shielded cabling to connect the gain controls to the switching relays. You know, I would have had a little bit more top-end magic, and, you know.
Yeah, yeah. So what guitar is usually in your hand when you're doing your tweaks, or does that change?
Look, it changes. For me, I think it's really important. I mean, there are guitars that are an indulgence for me, that I love playing as beautiful instruments, but they're not unique. They're not common instruments. So one of the things that's really important for me is to be respectful of the guitarist that's going to be playing the product.
Okay.
So I love, for example, playing my Charles Celia guitar.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a couple of Crosleys. I love playing those. You know, both of them are, you know, Australian-made guitars, beautiful instruments, but they're not instruments that a lot of people play. So when I'm designing, when I'm testing, I've got to play my Les Paul. I don't have a Les Paul, but I've got a very nice, effectively an Epiphone that I've had Charles do some work on, some refrets, and drop Seymour Duncans into it, change the hardware, and, you know, it's quite a nice playing instrument. So got to play a Les Paul, got to play a Strat, got to play a Telly.
Yeah.
Obviously, you know, testing a metal amp with a Telly isn't the best choice.
Funny you should say that, because I did an interview with Luke Palmer from Dead Letter Circus a few months ago now, and I was very surprised to learn that he was using a stock Telecaster
Right, okay.
to play prog metal.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, look, I actually think, in terms of, if you want to find out what your weakness of your amplifier is, me personally, I go for a Telly.
Yep.
A Telly is not a guitar that covers anything up. If there's something wrong, you're going to find it out with a Telly. So, so most of my stuff has a Telly test, and it has to pass the Telly test.
Cool.
Yeah.
So, Michael, when I was talking to my friend Richard at Hughes and Kettner a couple of weeks ago, he brought up that the technology in their new Black Spirit 200 amplifier, that their head designer stumbled on something from washing machine design in terms of their knobs and being able to store where the knobs are. Have you come across technology from something completely different to guitar, which most people would think is irrelevant, that you've gone, hang on, that'll work in my designs? Does anything like that spring to mind to you?
That's a good question, actually. Not really, I must admit, but probably what I have done is taken a real engineering approach to it.
Okay.
So, for example, I had a design for a multi-voltage, high voltage supply on an amplifier. One of the problems then is, well, what happens with your bias voltage? You need to constantly readjust the bias voltage every time you change the high voltage in a regular fixed bias amplifier. So then, kind of going back to engineering principles, went and designed a negative voltage multiplier using discrete components. So that's not something that you would find in a guitar amplifier. It actually just comes out of real fundamental electronics design. And so kind of implemented stuff like that. It's also really great. I mean, my father is still a very great influence on me, and because he's got a real outsider's perspective on all of this stuff. So it's always great to go, oh, look, Dad, I've done this, and often he'll just go, oh, why didn't you do it like that?
Cool.
Yeah, so he's got so he's been very influential from that perspective.
Nice one. I was just scanning through the comments there, and Nick Kane is just asked me if I can ask you the difference between the original Iron Duke and the version 2.
Yeah. When I designed the original Iron Duke, I had a particular goal in mind with that. So I wanted to make it fairly simple, so not too complex. So there were some things in there that I didn't implement because I was trying to hit a particular price point. So one of those, for example, was the effects loop. So the original Iron Duke just has a simple insert effects loop. So the output of the master volume control goes to the jack, effects send jack, and then if you've got nothing plugged in, it just shorts the return jack and then sends it to the power amplifier. So things like that were kind of a budgetary constraint. I kind of thought, oh no, there's a part of me that feels very guilty releasing a product when I know I could have done it better. So that passive loop always bugged me. So I thought, no, I need to fix the loop. So then I implemented a proper effects loop. The other thing that I did as well was one of the big changes, I think, was actually as a result of that constant tweaking, constant listening. After I released the Iron Duke version 1, what I did was that was when I had a real revelation in terms of my PCB layout technique. And just as an experiment, I thought, okay, I'm going to keep the components exactly where they are on the PCB. I'm going to keep the tracks connecting the components exactly the same, but I'm going to completely redo the way I do my ground connections. And I'll see if the amplifier sounds different. And so I did that, and all of a sudden, all the top end just opened up in the amplifier. And I went, oh, yeah, okay, so all those little 1% and 2% all over the place were really robbing the top end.
Yeah.
So that was another change that I made. So really completely rethought the way that I did the PCB layout in order to make sure that it has a much more present point-to-point kind of vibe to it.
Okay.
There's little tweaks as well in terms of the way that the tone stacks work. So the version 1 was probably a little bit too dark of an amplifier. So what I did was I actually borrowed a little trick from Bogner for the treble control, where the treble control is now an audio taper as opposed to a linear taper. So it has a lot more range in the second half than it does in the lower half. Because what I found with the Iron Duke was that people weren't turning the treble down; they were always turning the treble up and going, "Oh, I just need a little bit more." So, just change little things like that. There's many more tonal options as well. So with the version 1, there were 2 modes per channel. Now there's 3 modes per channel. One of the things I found with version 1 was, for me personally, I'd loved the sound of, on the clean channel, just cranking the master volume all the way up and only using the gain control as the one volume control. It just gave a much more present, immediate, vintage sort of sound. So that was one of the things I did on version 2 was I actually dropped the master volume for the clean channel, so that you've only got the input gain control as the only one. But then that freed up space on the front panel, so then I gave the boosted clean its own gain control. So there's a lot more flexibility there in terms of the tone. Yeah. Cool.
So Michael, going into these, I like to ask questions so I can learn myself. And am I right in thinking that on an amplifier design, if it's a passive design, everything on 10 is just letting the full signal through, but with an active, as you go past 12 o'clock, you're actually adding to it? Is that right?
Yeah. Well, in most cases, I mean,
in most cases,
there are tricks around that. So, for example, you could have a step-up transformer coupling transformer, so you can actually get more voltage out than you put in, but you get less current out.
Okay.
So there are tricks around that, but as a general rule, yes. So for example, with EQ, typical EQ networks on guitar amps are passive. So if you measure the voltage going into the EQ, the voltage that you get out of it is always less. So so the EQ basically is only a cutting EQ.
Okay.
Not
Yeah. And yours is based on that passive design?
Oh well, that was in terms of my EQ, yes.
Yep.
But my reference previously to passive was about the effects loop.
Okay. Yeah.
So the effects loop had no active elements in there driving the effects. So in other words, when you plugged something into the effects loop, it just was connected directly to the volume control of the channel. And there was no recovery stage after that, so you had to rely on your effects unit to be able to drive the power amp appropriately.
Sure. So when you're actually voicing your amplifiers, are you doing that with all the knobs at 12 o'clock or the EQ wise?
Yeah, I'd like to, but So I always voice the amps for me personally, and I also get feedback from other musicians. So I like to do a lot of beta testing as well with new designs as well, where I send it out to mates who are once back when people were gigging mates, to try stuff out and tell me how it went.
Yep.
But I like to voice my stuff so that at 12 o'clock I get the sound that I imagine, but I'm also I have a bit of a fear of disappointing people. I don't like disappointing people. So my fear is always that my idea of a good tone is not going to be someone else's.
Yep.
So because of that, I like to give people maybe a few too many options. I like to make sure that my EQs have a big sweep on them. So that just in case my idea of a good EQ is not someone else's idea of a good EQ, I like to make sure that I give them lots of options how much top end and attack there is, or how, So I tend to over option my designs, and I look very enviously at very confident amp designers who go, "This sounds bloody awesome," and that's just the way it is.
Sure. So, what speaker cab are you actually doing your testing on? And do you sell speaker cabs as part of your amplifier line?
Not anymore. I used to, but the speaker manufacturer I was using has Let me backtrack a little bit. I like to make sure that my products are very well priced. So I like to make sure that I bring the price point down as low as I can whilst keeping quality and engineering and reliability and everything as high as possible. So because of that, the approach that I took with my speaker cabs was I contracted a company in the US to do the assembly, but the minimum order on those is 50. So for a small manufacturer,
that's a lot.
Yeah, to have to, so the first run of quad boxes that I ordered, I think, hung around for maybe 6 years. So it's just a big investment So unfortunately, I can't really do that anymore. But in terms of cabs, I think once again it's important to pay proper respect to the guitarist who's going to use it. So because I don't provide cabs now, I know that people are going to be playing. It depends on the amplifier. So for example, I'm assuming that if somebody buys a 180 watt megalith, that they're not going to be plugged into a 210. Chances are they're going to have at least a pretty chunky 212 or a quad box.
Yeah.
What 212 or quad box is going to be? Chances are it's either going to be a Marshall cab. Yep. With G12 T75s.
Yep, that's what I got right there.
Or it's going to be a Mesa cab with vintage 30s or something, or Orange cab with vintage 30s or something like that.
Yeah. Yep.
So I always make sure that I test against those sorts of benchmarks.
Sure.
If I'm I'm working on a couple of lower wattage amplifiers at the moment, so there's a pretty good chance that it's I need to make sure it sounds good with a 112.
Cool.
If it doesn't sound good with a 112, if it needs a quad box for it to sound good, then I haven't done the design right.
Okay.
So it's really just about being as respectful as possible to the end user.
Yep. And it's funny you said using the word quad box as I do. Did you know that that's an Australian thing? That the rest of the world don't say that? I only just found that out recently. I did an interview with Thomas Blug of Blue Guitar, and mid-sentence, mid-interview, he said, "There's this word you guys use for 4x12." I'm what, like a quad box? And he goes, "Yeah, nobody says that. That's Australian." I had no idea until then.
Yeah, I had no idea until you found that out. So I only learnt that watching your channel.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
See, somebody does watch my channel. So, folks, please like, subscribe, all that stuff. I don't have that many subscribers just yet, but I'm getting a lot of comments from people internationally going, "Oh my God, I've just found your channel. I can't believe the guests that you got lined up and everything. This will be huge soon." You just keep going.
Admit, I do feel very much out of my depth with the caliber of guests that you typically have on. So thank you very much.
Not at all. Michael, I was actually on a forum, groomed noodlers, having a look around, and somebody had posted a clip of one of your amps, and I sort of left a little question there. Hey, if I reached out to Michael and organised him, and it was quite a few people, a lot of Canadians actually, that said, yes, please. So if any of you guys are actually in the house watching this live, here he is, and thank you guys for the suggestion. Actually, there's some people there saying quad box, ? I got your 4x12, yeah. That's Brent from Philadelphia. Sorry, I read that wrong. Bent Tom from Philadelphia. Now, I did see a question back here if I go back. Okay, from Tony Batal. I hope I'm saying that right.
Hey, Tony, how's it going?
You know Tony, do you?
Yes.
Yeah. What specific factors from the Diesel Herbert and Bogner Uberschall did you get the influence from in designing the Megalith series?
Yeah. So the Megalith is actually quite interesting, the design process that I went through with that. So I'm not a metal guy myself, but I actually love the challenge of metal. You have to be a very careful designer to be able to produce that much gain and keep everything stable, So I love the challenge of it. And, growing up in the 80s and being into what was, I listened to, all the regular big head culprits of the time. So, I do like a good chunky guitar sound. But I'm not a metal player, and certainly metal had evolved since I grew up listening to it. So I did an initial design of the amplifier. It had a lot of gain, but all of those factors that we were talking about, power supply and transformer and negative feedback and all that sort of stuff, was all fairly conventional. So there's a lot of distortion going on, but it didn't sound metal. And I was like, I thought that all I needed to do was distortion. So then I thought, I need to actually listen to what people are doing. So I actually went up and either borrowed or purchased a whole bunch of metal amps.
Cool.
Just to see what modern metal actually sounded like. And the two standouts for me were the Diesel Herbert and the Bogner Uberschall. Mm-hmm. The two of those were for my ears, were at two complete opposite ends of the spectrum. The Herbert, particularly once you dimed the gain control, was super tight, super compressed. I know that with the Herbert, a lot of people say tight. What are you talking about? But you literally have to have the gain control on full. And the Herbert I had actually was I was lucky enough to get my hands on the very first Herbert ever built.
Wow.
Yeah, so in fact, it turns out that it was actually one of 5 that Peter Diesel made as prototypes, and my one is actually number 1. So I know that the design has evolved since then. So maybe the current production ones don't quite do this, but it was an interesting phenomenon with that particular Herbert, where at the end of its gain range, it really tightened up the sound. It also sounded very compressed, and to the point where it almost sounded like you weren't listening to an amplifier, but you were listening to a recording of an amplifier. So that was really quite interesting for me. I took it over to a good mate, Pete Reynolds, place. He's a wonderful amp designer and somebody I really look up to here in Sydney. Took it to his place and he plugged into it and said, "Oh, it sounds like a modelling amp," which I thought was a really interesting description of it. But what he was trying to get at was that it sounds really finessed and very, like it had gone through a whole bunch of processing before you actually heard the sound coming out of the speakers. And then I got my hands on an Uberschall, and that was the complete opposite. The Uber was just frightening in real life.
Yeah.
It just had so much. It just felt like it was trying to attack you. as opposed to the diesel, which sounded beautiful and refined and huge and all that sort of stuff, but you didn't have that fear factor that you had with the Uberschall. And just the Uberschall just had so much top end and so much sizzle, and so for me, they then became two different loci for kind of what modern metal amps sounded like, and that really had a big influence, I think, on the way I approached the design for the Megalith. So for the Megalith, I love that tightness that you got out of the Herbert and the speed of the response when the gain's all the way up, but I didn't like the fact that when you turn the gain down that it loosened things up. And then by the same token, I loved the fact that with the Uberschall, it had this real immediacy to the tone, and just really felt quite present. To me, it felt a little bit too present, where it, like I said, it was almost scary to be in front of. So I kind of dialed that down a little bit with my amp design. So that were the two things that I took from the diesel and the Uberschall. Two remarkable and very different amplifier designs that I have a lot of respect for. So that was how my amp design was influenced.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now you said about that immediacy. Do you find a lot of that comes from the power amp section, whether you're using 6L6s versus EL34s, etc.? And what is your preference in output tubes?
I think it depends on the application. Obviously, with something like the Iron Duke, then a good set of EL34s is what you want. With something like the Megalith, it's really about headroom, and so that's designed around the larger power tubes, so 6550s, KT88s. Mm-hmm. I actually really like the sound of KT120s with the Megalith. The issue is that they're bloody expensive. From a production perspective, they're not worth the extra. You get extra performance out of them, and definitely more hugeness, more power. With a pair of KT 120s, it's over 200 watts that I get out of a Megalith Beta.
Wow!
Wow! So it's quite an impressive valve. But but in terms of your original question about the that immediacy you get from the design, valves definitely do play a part in that, but it's not just the valves. With something like the both the Herbert and the diesel, they both have very unique negative feedback configurations, which is different to standard amplifiers. And certainly with the Uber, part of the magic of that amplifier is that on those higher frequencies you effectively don't have negative feedback. So like you've mucked around with dual rectifier, right?
Yep.
So it's kind of like the difference between the vintage and the modern mode.
Okay.
Modern mode, you get rid of the negative feedback, and it just all of a sudden it's got this, to the sound.
Cool.
And so,
mate, you mentioned about the hair metal days back in the 80s, and that was a big influence for me as well. I started playing guitar in bands in 88 at the age of 14 years old, doing the pub thing. And a lot of people back then, it was all about the Jose mods or Lee Jackson modifications. Is there anything that those guys were doing that directly influenced what you do?
Oh, look, I did. So on the Iron Duke, I do have some of the clipping mods that are referred to as the Jose mods. But I did kind of miss that boat a little bit. So by the time I started looking into amp designs, the higher gain amplifiers were then starting to become a lot more prominent. So, I mean, one of the things that's interesting with Jose and Lee Jackson and all that sort of stuff is that that they were trying to fill a particular void that was missing, which is kind of high gain amps that were naturally high gain that didn't need to be pushed with something else in order to get that sort of distortion. But by the time I came onto the scene, you had your Messrs and your Soldanos and all that sort of stuff. It's also quite interesting because I think so much of our idea of gain is really about the way that the gain is delivered, not necessarily the amount of clipping that you get or the onset of clipping. So, there are some older designs that actually do have quite a bit of gain. So, for example, the Dumble designs and the Mark series from Mesa, which obviously go back to the 70s, actually had quite a bit of distortion. Very high gain amplifiers even by modern standards, but just because they were delivered with a more standard transformers, power supply filtering, negative feedback, all that sort of stuff, really smooths out that aggression.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you find that you've got to dial in maybe more gain into your amplifiers than you feel is needed? I know a lot of people were very surprised when they play through my rigs at how little gain I actually have, and it's more that I hit it hard to get a particular sound. But on the other hand, I've heard people working with Eddie Van Halen says that, particularly in recent years, he's just always more gain.
Yeah.
Is that something that you're trying to incorporate that there's a demand for?
Well, certainly in terms of the megalith, I designed that particular amplifier with more gain than anybody should possibly need. So my benchmark was, of all those amps that I tested, the highest gain one was the Herbert.
Okay.
And so what I wanted to do with my amp was have as much gain with my gain at 12 o'clock as the Herbert had on its highest gain channel with the gain maxed. So my thinking, once again, is A, to pay respect to the guitarist,
mm-hmm.
And also not to dictate to them what a reasonable amount of gain is. I didn't want to say, that's all the gain that you should need. If you need more, then you need to go practice. That's none of my business,
Yep.
So I set it up like I try to set it up where, 12 o'clock is about everything that I could possibly need, and then just stand back and let the guitarist make the choice themselves. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Now, if people want to actually hear your amp designs, if they're interested in it, where can they get their hands on them? Do you sell direct to the public, or do you have distribution internationally?
Yeah. So for the amps, I sell direct. It's kind of a business decision on my part. I really like to have contact with my customers. Maybe it's a little bit juvenile on my part, but being kind of running this one-man show and being isolated, it really does absolutely make my day when I get an email from somebody going, "Oh man, thank you so much. That was exactly what I wanted." I also want to hear if things don't work. I want people to say, "Oh, I wish you'd do that." And so to have that interaction with customers, particularly for amps, which is so personal, I really do want that. The other thing as well is, basically I sell stuff at wholesale prices.
Yep.
I make the amps myself. PCBs are obviously printed at a PCB factory, but I do all the assembly myself. I design the transformers. The chassis come in bent and welded and powder coated for me, but I do all of the assembly. I tweak stuff the way people want. And something like, say, that the Megalith Gamma is 1,800 Aussie, which is US dollars is about 1,200, I think now, or maybe even a little bit less than that. So 1,200 US dollars for a handmade amplifier.
That's bloody good.
It should be a fairly not too much of a hassle for people, but I think the thing that's really tricky from a business perspective Yeah, so that's why I sell direct.
Okay.
Another option for me would be to go through retailers. And the way I think is that the user will end up with the same product, but they'll just have paid a lot more for it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to do people a favor by doing those direct
Absolutely.
sales. The other thing as well, people often ask me about endorsements and all that sort of stuff. And I kind of, now I know this isn't true, but I once heard an interview with Jim Marshall saying he doesn't do endorsements. Now I know that's obviously changed,
yep.
But he said very early on that somebody from a band came along and said, "Look, man, we want a good deal on your amplifier, and we're going to make you big if you help us out." And he said to them, "Look, I can do that, but I've got to make money. So if you're not going to pay for the amplifier, then the next kid that buys it off me is going to have to cover that cost." So my approach has been to try to keep the price as low as possible, but just to treat everybody as fairly as possible as well. I could go through retail stores. I could, contact all the people, a whole bunch of the guitarists that I've met throughout my career and palm off stuff to them and get them to say how great it is.
Yep.
And hopefully, it's genuine that they do enjoy it.
Yep.
But then the punter at the end of the day is going to have to bear the cost of that.
Sure.
And there's just something ethically about that I really do struggle with.
Yeah.
And I feel like I could just wake everyone up and go, look, you could get the same thing for a lot less if you just wanted to use your ears as opposed to use what the opinion of a guitar magazine says, or the opinion of a famous guitarist.
Yeah. I think the day of the guitar magazine is definitely on its way out, just in terms of reach versus YouTubers and the like, which puts me in a very interesting position in that I've become friends over the last year or so with a lot of the designers and CEOs from a lot of big companies. And a lot of them are asking me about, man, Australia's our worst market. Why the hell can't we sell amps over there? What gives? And I've tried to give them feedback, and some of it comes down to the middlemen, the distributors over here. Now, I guess one of the advantages of having a distributor internationally is if something happens to the amplifier and you need to get repairs. Usually you've got an authorized repair service. If somebody was to buy one of your amps overseas and or even in Australia, because it's a very big place, and they need to get repairs done, is that something that you have them send the amplifier back, or are you okay with handing over schematics to somebody to say, this is what needs to be done? Can you do the repair?
Yeah. Well, look, the vast majority of problems that you get with a tube amp are going to be the tubes. So working out which tube has failed and replacing that should be, an amp tech should be able to do that without having to, get schematics for the switching system or whatever.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
The other approach I take with my designs is I really like to make sure that stuff is over-engineered.
Yep.
So to give you an idea, my amps end up being quite heavy. Now, the reason for that is, so something like the Iron Duke, the stock audio transformer that I use with that is one that I designed that handles 160 watts of power for a 50-watt amplifier. That's 160 watts RMS continuous down to 40 hertz. So you can actually push that transformer, and I have, all the way to 300 watts.
Wow.
With the full guitar frequency response.
Yeah.
So you've got effectively a 300 watt amplifier, a 300 watt transformer in a 50 watt amplifier. So, you would have to be extremely unlucky or have done something absolutely crazy to blow up a transformer like that.
Yeah.
And same thing with say for example the power supply capacitors. So if the plate's running at 500 volts, then I've got 800 volts worth of capacitors in there. I get all my potentiometers, shipped directly from the manufacturer, so I don't. My pots haven't been sitting in a warehouse for 15 years. So stuff going wrong is actually quite rare. If something does go wrong, then often it's just the tube. I don't think I've ever had a part failure in an amp that I've shipped overseas.
Wow.
The amps that have, local guys here in Australia prefer to send the amps to me for me to look at, because they're my babies and I know them well. And so, 99% of the time, like I said, it's just a tube failure or maybe a scratchy pot or something like that needs to be fixed up. And I handle that myself. I must admit, lately I've been a little bit slack with that because I've just been so busy that repairs have banked up a little bit. I try to be reasonable with that as well.
Yep.
Yeah, and certainly reasonable in terms of cost. So one of the good things about sending stuff to me is if something comes in, I know straight away what the problem is.
Yeah.
It doesn't take me very long to work it out. And even if I do, I don't overcharge for labour and that sort of stuff. So
Cool. Folks, if you have any questions for Michael, now would be a good time to drop some in the comments section there. As I just asked you, Michael, I noticed just talking to some builders lately that with all the government incentives out there to help people through the weird times we're going through, a lot of people are using their money on gear. Have you found that you're very busy right now?
Yes. Yeah. Look, I mean, I'm very happy. I mean, look, when all hell broke loose, I really was expecting everything to just completely die. Yeah. And when that happened, I thought to myself, I was going to end up being very, very quiet. And so I was really prepping for the worst. But in fact, what I found was that sales picked up, and I suspect that there was a whole bunch of musicians at home, maybe a little bit bored, who've ended up with a little bit of extra disposable cash and picked stuff up, which is great, which is fantastic. I've got no complaints. I hope that continues. I mean, I hope obviously that things go back to normal for everybody. There's a lot of weird stuff happening at the moment in the world, and I feel very I feel very bad for 2019. I feel like as if 2019 actually was a pretty good year, and 2020 has just proven how bad things can be. So I really do hope things go back to normal. But yeah, in terms of sales and all that sort of stuff, I have found actually that guitarists have had a bit of disposable income at the moment, and are happy to, and are sitting at home bored going, I need new toys. So
very well covered there, Michael, as I went and had a quick bio break, as I explained to you beforehand. I sit here and drink coffee all morning, and then halfway into these it hits me. I do believe I didn't.
I used my joke about feeling bad for 2019 and everything, and you weren't there to laugh at it. So
I was actually listening because I am going by Bluetooth today, and I did warn you beforehand, and I said if I do this, funny thing is I hadn't switched the screen, so the viewers would have seen me doing that and wondering what was that all about. These things happen. It's usually that or battery, which I seem to be doing okay with at the moment. I'm just going to see here if there's any questions that people would like us to answer. So from Nick Kane, if owning an original Iron Duke, can it be sent to you to be upgraded to be closer to a version 2?
That is a kind of a trick question. I mean, anything is possible, but the reality is that... let me take a step back. So the layout of the PCB is different. It bolts differently into the chassis. The chassis looks different, so you'd need a new PCB, a new chassis. Transformers are the same. I could reuse the transformers, but basically you're paying pretty much for a new amplifier. Okay. So unfortunately, no. And look, for anyone who owns the V1, I say to you, the way it works with guitar, we've seen it multiple times. Manufacturer says, I'm going to make an improvement, and then everybody goes, "Oh, I like the original better."
Yeah, that does happen, doesn't it?
Yeah, it always happens. But yeah, the thing that I find really fascinating with guitarists is we're actually surprised. We're, given the fact that we're rebellious rock and rollers, we're surprisingly conservative. Everything that came out first is always the best, and any attempt at fixing it, the shortcomings, is invariably met with a "no, you've stuffed it up."
Yeah. I wonder if that's because, the first impression thing, people get used to a sound, and then if you mess with that, even if like technically you think it's better spec wise and everything, they're used to that sound, and it's probably what it comes down to, huh?
Yeah. So Nick, hold on to your V1, mate. I think it'll be worth a lot one day.
Now, Cliff Gold wants to know if there's any new amp designs in the works.
Oh man, do I have new amp designs? I've got so many that I'm working on at the moment, and this is part of my ADD problem.
It's not a bad thing, man. Not a bad thing.
Oh, look. So I've got I've got a whole bunch that are coming up that I'm prototyping in parallel. So first one of those is a little amplifier that I'm calling the Bonaparte.
Cool.
Which is actually a design that I've been toying around with for since the Iron Duke came out. The Iron Duke actually was meant to have a rival Bonaparte, and the joke there is that Iron Duke is the nickname of the Duke of Wellington, the Duke of Wellington, who beat Napoleon Bonaparte at the Battle of Waterloo. And so I've got the Iron Duke, and then on the other side I've got Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte.
Cool.
And the Bonaparte is this very compact amplifier. It's only about 30 centimeters wide, but still like a full 45, 50 watt 6L6. So that's a much more polite and refined amplifier compared to the Iron Duke, which is a big British brute.
Yep.
This one is continental and very French. Well, very polite and refined. So I've got that, and I've been mucking around and tuning that. So I've just got another iteration of the that design that I'm going to prototype next. Then I've got a whole bunch of 100 watters that I'm working on, almost just for personal use, but I'll see where they go. I kind of thought to myself, the ultimate Soldano idea. So I'm going to prototype that and see what happens. I recently got rid of my I owned for a very long time a Bogner Ecstasy, which I absolutely love.
Cool.
And after that went out the door, I went, I miss the Ecstasy. So I started to then design up a kind of a replacement Ecstasy for myself. But I thought, okay, if I was to do an Ecstasy, what would I do? What would I take away or add to it to make it my idea of the ultimate Ecstasy? So I've got that. I'm also working on the ultimate Dumble design. So that's an amplifier that I prototyped maybe 5-6 years ago, called the Crystal Lattice. So the Crystal Lattice is making a comeback. I've got a whole bunch of combo designs as well. So I've got a Fendery combo that is going to go into the next prototype stage very soon with a beautiful 4-knob spring reverb and tremolo. I've got what else do I have? I've got a Marshall style amplifier as well in the Duke lineage. This one's called the Duchess.
Okay.
That I've been mucking around with for a while, so that'll hopefully come out in both head and combo format. I've got then a whole bunch of really small tube amps, so little 20 watters. Kind of a high gain design, a micro Duke, Iron Duke. What did I call that one? I think I call that the Princeling. Duke, Duchess, Princeling.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
And then and also kind of a big Iron Duke design, 100 watt. I call the Grand Duke. And then I've got little high gain amplifier. I wanted to muck around with the design where it's just a little, very compact single channel 20 watt amplifier, no channel switching. So the idea being that the gain, if you've got it about 9 o'clock, it's kind of clean, but then by the time you go all the way to the end, it's got kind of megalith levels of gain.
Cool.
Yeah, so I was just interested in that really from a technical perspective. So I got that design. I've got a little micro Dumbley design as well that I'm working on. And then I've got a whole bunch of rack stuff that I'm working on. A little rack mount 3-channel preamp, but designed in a way where I can customize the voicings for people as well. Nice. So that they can say, look, I want amps A, B, and C for the 3 channels. Can you do that for me? And then I design it and assemble it for them in a one rack unit preamp design. I've also got working on a whole bunch of programmable things. So what I'm wanting to do, and this is something I've been working on for a long time now, but I keep not getting around to it, is to really look at doing a pure vacuum tube equivalent of something like an Axe-Fx.
Cool.
So that's something that's been, to really take the Revelation idea and just expand it dramatically, but also to make it software upgradable as well. So that's stuff I'm working on. Tube preamps. So I was thinking of doing a Revelation pedal. That might be kind of fun.
Nice.
And the other thing as well, I'd be interested in if there are people watching this online. I'm really tempted to put out an amp kit.
Cool.
Now, the only thing that holds me back is really there's 2 things. There's kind of the liability aspect of things. Mm-hmm. So if I sell an amp kit and regardless of the warnings I put on, if somebody decides that they want to lick a capacitor, am I going to be in trouble for that? So that's one aspect of things. The other thing is I wanted to do it as an open-ended design. So what I do is I give them a booklet basically with all of the theory, and I say to them, look, this is just a blank canvas. So I'm providing all the infrastructure. You then go and paint by numbers. So you have a blank, preamp design where you look at the designs that you want and you fill in the values, and you go, right, okay, so I need a 470k resistor here. I'll load the 470k resistor. So that way you can actually build your own 3-channel 100-watt amplifier the way that you want. Mm-hmm. And I'm really excited about that idea.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Not because I know that there's a lot of people who tinker with it, and the only options at the moment for kit stuff is really, here's a Plexi kit, or here's a Fender Deluxe Reverb kit, or they're all beautiful designs and all that sort of stuff. But I thought there's no one out there actually doing modern amps as kits. So imagine kind of like a 3-channel 100-watt. Build your own amp, whatever you want. You want a Soldano high gain with a JCM 800 crunch and a Fender clean, go for it. With MIDI switching and all that sort of stuff. And I know for me, as somebody who went through the process of building your own stuff and then being able to bring it to rehearsal and going, look what I did, there's so much pride.
Absolutely.
In that,
So Bruce Egnator has his amp building classes that he does in the States. Yeah, and I'm actually just locking in a time with Bruce to come on the show as well. Awesome. And it might be worth asking him about the legalities of it, but he has people in the room with him going through it. But people rave about the amps that they build for themselves at these. Now, Cliff Gold is asking, what about a load/reamp? Is that something you've ever considered, is putting a load into your amps so that people can use their choice of IRs later and not have to... Yep.
So all of those small amps that I was talking about, the Princeling and the high gain 1-channel amp and the little Dumbley one and the little Fendery one as well. So all of those have got mic simulated outputs as well with internal loads.
Cool.
So that's something I'm thinking. But in terms of a standalone load box, look, I think part of the problem with that is, I think there's already a whole bunch of really good solutions out there for reloading. Whenever I do something, I don't do something because I think, me too. Somebody's done an amp like this, and I go, okay, I'm going to do an amp just like it.
Yep.
I think to myself, what can I bring to the table? And if I can't quite bring something that sets my product apart, then I don't want to do it. so when it comes to a load box, I think I'm not entirely sure what I could bring to the table that isn't already out there. There's already a lot of really good solutions out there, and there are some aspects of manufacture where having a big corporation, working as a big corporation, really does add up from a cost perspective. As in it really makes a lot of sense. So so for example, having inductors wound is an expensive exercise, and so to have a proper reactive load, you need to have an appropriate reactive component to it. And so it's one of those things where I could do it, but it might end up being a bit expensive and provide something not that different to what's already out there. So I was looking at it also from the consumer's perspective. If I was to walk into a guitar shop or go online, what would make me buy that particular product over something else? And if I can't justify that for my own product, then I don't put it out, basically. So, yeah.
There's some great feedback about that idea there, Michael, just going through. And somebody has actually said, this is from Nick Kane, what about pedal kits as well? Has that ever crossed your mind?
Yeah. Well, I actually did do that as well. So maybe about 10 years ago, I think we released a dual-channel overdrive pedal kit, and the idea being basically, and this is the thing I like to do. I don't want to tell people what to do.
Yep.
But I want to provide enough information for them to have the platform there and all the infrastructure that they need, and then also to explain the way that things work. I mean, that's one of the things I actually quite enjoy doing is teaching. And so this pedal kit actually came with instructions for how to design your own pedal, and if you want to build a tube screamer type of thing, you do this. If you want to build something a bit more like a Rat, do that. Here's the way an EQ works. Go nuts. And so so that was the approach that I took with the kit. Yeah, maybe I'll do that in the future. Actually,
cool.
That might be fun, and a lot less liability than a amplifier.
You never know. Just with your openness, it seems, to share the knowledge, you could end up mentoring some new great person, just in the way that Bruce Egnater brought up Dave Friedman and mentored him in the early days. You never know who might take the class. And
Oh, look, absolutely. I mean, I would love to do that. I forgot to say the other reason that stops me from doing it. I don't know how I would handle requests when things don't work. So that's the only thing that I just need to think about my own personal time. So, if you want to be making a living, then obviously you need to charge for your time.
That's right.
So I don't know. One of the things I thought about doing maybe is pricing these kits with some support time built into the price.
Okay.
And then if you need more support than that, then then maybe I'll have some kind of support rate afterwards. But
cool.
So that's something I need to. Yeah, and I think as well, doing things remotely. Debugging something via email is a very tricky process. And so I could imagine that it'd be one of those. I could imagine plenty of scenarios where we end up exchanging, 25 emails that take up, 4 hours of my time and 4 hours of their time, and then you find out that, they forgot to plug something in.
Yeah.
Yep. And so that sorts of things are put a bit of a damper on my kit idea.
Yeah, sure. Cliff Gold is saying Fryette is the only tube power amp load available, and that's one right beside me there. It's actually quite a fair way behind me. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. I get what he means now. So I thought he was talking about a standalone load box.
Yeah, yep. Same. But that's one thing. There are other load boxes out there with power amps built into them, and I've had that one. That's a version 1. I think they've got a version 2. I do have a slight little issue with that. I still use it now and then, and I did talk to someone at Boutique Amps about that to pass on to Steve Fryette, just the issue I was having with it. Brandy77 is asking, what's the craziest mod that someone has asked for in the Megalith series?
I've only done this once. So I had one customer ask for more gain.
Wow.
So I squeezed as much gain as I could out of the design. I said, look, I mean, they hadn't heard the amplifier before, but so that's probably the craziest thing. I mean, look, I do get a lot of requests about cosmetic things with the amps, which I'm more than happy to oblige. But like I said, the way I do my manufacture is to try to invest in as much parts as possible.
Yep.
So, for example, retolexing a box is a bit of a pain for me. I love the look of custom amps, but it is a bit challenging for me in terms of my time. So so for example, like the Megalith, I've got a whole stack of head shells already done up in black with the black Gorilla cloth because that's what the standard look is.
Okay.
And my pricing is based around that. So people ask for custom Tolexes, Perspex fronts, LED lighting on the inside. All that sort of stuff. Yeah.
I did warn you, Michael, that I'm running on batteries over here and that it would run out at one point, and I've just hit that, but that's okay. I can actually show people that's the view that Michael's seeing of me, just by the way, which is just my iMac. I do have a camera that I have set up, and I've just changed that over, so I'm going to go back to the shot of you, Michael, as I get that back up and running. It's no big problem. That's the danger of live. Look at that. I'm going to put this over here.
Awesome. Is that a Canon?
It is, and it's just the cheap M50, mate. The cheapest.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. People assume I've got some big bloody setup going on over here. Far from the truth. I find that you don't need all that expensive gear. It's all about your content, really, isn't it? And
now let me ask you a question.
Yeah, please do.
What do you think about rack? Is there a future?
I do, because fly gigs. And a lot of people have had to jump onto the whole bandwagon of Axe effects, etc. I think Thomas Blug's idea of having a floor amp, I'm not sure if you checked out the Blue Guitar Amp 1.
Yep.
I think he stumbled on something really good there. And so my whole thing with a floor amp is, if you're doing small gigs, I don't want to have pedals on the floor because beer and crap gets spilled all over it, and I'd hate to have the guts of everything on the floor. Back there, I've got I'm not sure if people can see. Let me just get out of the way. But in front of that Marshall box there,
Yeah.
I'll just move that. The foot controller that you can see in front of that, I actually bought it out off the band 9 Inch Nails. I'm a big fan of Trent Reznor and his work, and when he went on hiatus for a little while, he sold all his gear up on the fan club, and I bought that because I would rather have a controller on the floor controlling a rack behind me. And that's probably why the floor amp thing. When I was touring in a Queen show, I was in a group called the Killer Queen Experience and doing international gigs, and I was touring with a Kemper. And the great thing about that was it was back over yonder, plugged in a power lead and 2 outputs to front of house. But I had the remote foot controller. I didn't need any power on the floor. I just go down the front, plonk that, and I was set up ready to go at a festival gig in no time. Future in rack gear? For me, yes, because as I said, I'd rather have just a controller like that, which pour water on it, it's going to live, as opposed to having everything on the floor, all my pedals, etc. So I do like the idea of rack. Plus, I started, I've got the ADA there. I've actually borrowed a JMP1 as well to do a bit of some tone comparisons with. So that's a big yes from me on rack.
Yeah, no, that's, I really do hope it comes back. I mean, I think it's it's a very interesting format, and I think that the way that music's going as well. I mean, look, as you know, clearly this conversation we've talked a lot about amps. I mean, I think that I would love to see amps continue the way that they are, but I think things are going to evolve, and so I certainly do hope that rack makes a resurgence.
Yeah. I was very surprised, well, not surprised, but I finally learnt from an article that I saw online recently from Steve Fryette, who's pretty much the king of the rack power amps, the VHT days, now with the Fryette company. The difference that people are hearing between a head and a rack is that the power supply. You know, in a head, you've got one power supply feeding both the preamp, power amp, as opposed to separate power supplies in rack units. If they're knowing that, if there was a way that, I don't know, can you have a connector IEC cable coming off one power supply to feed the other? Would that help the synergy of it all?
Yep, no, definitely. And certainly one of the things that I'm looking at is, in fact, a control signal. So it's obviously it's a little bit dangerous playing with high voltages coming out of one unit and plugging into another. So another option is to, which is what I'm looking at exploring, is in fact a control signal that comes out of the power amplifier that basically tells the preamp what voltage it's producing.
Okay.
And then the preamp then has a power supply that tracks the power amp supply. Yeah, so in other words, to create that same feel. I know, for example, on the Synergy stuff as well, they've got that sag control, which seems to be effective as well. Yeah, I mean, I think that that might be interesting. I think to do it properly, I think that there might be the need to make sure that we're looking at multiple parameters at the same time. So not just the sag, but also maybe some things to do with interstage feedback as well. That might be good to explore as well. Actually, speaking of which, let me throw it out there for somebody to get really rich and famous doing.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that would be really cool would be for somebody to develop a feedback system for guitars. So imagine on the Axe-Fx, okay, some kind of plug that you can plug into on the Axe-Fx, okay, that is connected into your guitar, right? And then what happens is kind of like a Sustainiac setup, where that signal then creates the effect that you would have if your amp was if you were standing in front of a real amp.
Yeah, right.
So, for example, imagine being able to then force the strings to vibrate a little bit.
Yep.
Like you've got a bit of SPL in the room.
That's funny you should say that. I am a former big user of the Sustainiac. If I just go to my one shot there, this is always fun doing this in reverse. So I'm thinking, oh, that guy right there is my Hamer, which is like about a 1991 Hamer USA Chaparral that used to have a Sustainiac in it. And I pulled that out in recent years because it was the old model. 2 9-volts it would run on, a little compartment in the back, and I'd get about an hour out of that before when it went flat, my bridge pickup would die, etc. So I pulled it out and just hardwired it without it. I do want to get the newer one, which apparently uses a fraction of the power. So I am familiar with the beauty of being able to flick a switch and just have controlled feedback. Now, Boss used to have a pedal that did a similar thing.
Yeah.
And I had one here. I'm not sure if Mickey picked it up. I'm just going to go have a look. But as a young fellow that I get paid to mentor, he's autistic, has autism. Apparently you can't say he's autistic, although you ask his parents that and they'll tell you to mind your own business. He's autistic. Musical genius. And he lent me a Boss pedal. He picked up some pedals. I'm going to have a quick look, see if it's still there. Because I am remote today. And you guys got to see that I am wearing my pajamas still. It's the beauty of doing these from home in the morning. I got this from Bobby Spencer. When at the first interview I did with Bob, he was in his pajamas. So for his second one, he invited himself back on 2 weeks later. I said, mate, you're more than welcome. And I went and bought pajamas for the occasion. But the Boss pedal, it was a little silver one. I can't think what it was called. And I have no idea how it works. But you could press and hold and initiate feedback.
Yeah, I remember that. I think it was called the Overdrive Feedbacker, and it came out in the late 80s.
I remember one called a super feedbacker. Super feedbacker and distortion.
Okay, right,
that was the yellow one.
Yep.
Mickey had a silver one, which looked like it was a bit newer. So there was 2 different models. I'd have to investigate that. But is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Well, no, because that the super feedbacker works with a PLL, a phase lock loop circuit, which basically think of it like this: it's a circuit that can be set up to resonate at whatever input frequency you give it.
Okay.
So kind of it's a fake simulation of what the feedback is.
Sure.
Well, certainly that's the way that the pedal that I had all those years ago worked. What I'm actually thinking is effectively something like a Sustainiac, but that drives your guitar strings based on the input that's coming from the amp modeler.
Okay.
Right? Because part of the problem with the amp modeler, as opposed to a real amplifier, is you miss that real that feedback that you get from a real guitar amplifier, where the amplifier, you drive the amplifier with your guitar, but the amplifier drives the speakers. The speakers pump the air. The air then changes the way the guitar strings vibrate. And an extreme case of that is when you get feedback. But even before you get to the point of feedback, your guitar sounds different because you're in the same room as the amplifier.
Yep.
It's just physics.
Yep.
So the thing I'm thinking about is something that actually drives the guitar strings to make them vibrate as if you've got SPL there in the room.
And would that require something installed on the guitar, some type of, I want to say transducer, but that's probably not the right word.
Yeah. Something to drive the steel strings. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Kind of a reverse pickup, which is what a Sustainiac is.
Yeah.
But obviously the thing with a Sustainiac is that it's being driven by the guitar signal.
And not the amp signal. That's where you're coming from. Folks, if somebody knows the know-how, there's a great idea there. And Michael seems happy to share that with folks. That's great.
Yeah. That would be fun to develop. But,
Nick Kane saying the FB2, the feedbacker booster. I think that's the silver one that Mickey had. Cool. Yeah. Might have to look that up, how that all works. Folks, if you've got any questions for Michael, I am going to round things up soon. We have hit the 2-hour marker. I told you it goes quick, doesn't it, mate?
It does, yeah.
Yeah. I always say to people, if we could get half hour out of you, I'd be happy. And I haven't had one that hasn't ended up going 2 hours, close to even 3 on a couple of the early ones, and I thought that's a bit too long. Speak now, forever hold your peace. It looks like no, we're done there, folks. Thank you a lot for tuning in, especially to Michael for giving me the time, mate. I've been wanted to chat to you for a while, so big round of applause for you as I hit the button.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hollis.
No problem. Mate, I have no doubt that after we hang up here, we'll probably end up chatting for quite a while because that's what happens. So, folks, thank you again. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I'll try and keep bringing you the guests like Michael and some of the other people I've had on lately on a bit of a roll. I'm going to keep it up. Thanks, guys. See ya.